the heart of the matter. I don't want to pretend for one moment that after the death of Alton Sterling, the death of Philando Castile, the 5 officers in Dallas, Texas, I'd be lying to you if I didn't say my own heart is heavy. And my own heart is actually tired of the racial divide in our country. I am exhausted. I am frustrated. I am angry. I am frustrated that the lives of black men seem to be worthless in a culture that seemingly does not care. And I'm frustrated because I don't know that the Christian voice has done all it needs to do to speak to these issues in a way that's transformative. I think there's something about truth that can transform a culture. And as I think about this, I recognize that race is a construct. It's not a truth. It's something that has been fashioned, formed, created. It's a construct. It's not a truth. And the sad reality is that it is a learned condition. And if it's a learned condition, it means it can be unlearned. And unfortunately, the voices that I long to hear who would speak to this, address this, they have not. I believe that when truth is taught, and if that truth is taught, then it has a way of changing the conditions and the culture and moving us forward in this issue that divides us. I have to tell you, all due respect to Miss Wendy Williams, there's a reason why there's an NAACP. There's a reason why there are historically black colleges and universities. There's a reason why there is a black church. People say to me, Dan, Pastor Williams, I wish there was no such thing as a black church. I was recently at the centennial for the AME Church, Richard Allen, African Methodist Episcopal Church down in the city. And quite frankly, the reality of the existence of HBCUs, the NAACP, and the black church is because they were responses to racism. They didn't just happen. And racism doesn't just occur. Racism cannot exist in a vacuum. It does not have a life of its own. It has to tether itself to a structure in order for it to exist. Racism can't exist in a void, in a vacuum. It has to connect itself to something in order to have a life. And it does not have a life of its own. There are structures in place. And until someone gets at this truth and begins to articulate this, I think we don't stand a chance. The truth is that this structure that provides for racist views has to be practiced. It has to be in an environment. It has to exert itself. And until somebody will say that, all due respect to Billy Graham, who most of you revere, whose ministry took place during the 60s when Philadelphia was burning, Los Angeles Watts were burning, Detroit was burning. Dr. Graham preached the gospel, yes, but never said a word about the conditions in the hood. And the gospel that I understand has social implications, or it's not the gospel. If the gospel doesn't impact a culture and a society, then it's not the whole gospel. And this silence of evangelical leaders who seem to ignore the issues of what race has done in the country, of how it continues to divide us, seem to be less than sincere. And I can't tell if it's an absence of sincerity or if it's a result of ignorance or it's a result of evil. It might be all three. But it's either ignorance or it's evil or the fact that, you know what, I'm insincere in how I'll handle biblical texts in order to meet the conditions of a culture that's screaming. White men don't die for selling cigarettes in America. They get tickets. White men don't die for broken taillights in America. They get tickets. And the reality of this situation is that officers across the board often abuse their power, and they should be punished for going too far. Now, I can't pretend that somehow I'm numb to these realities. You see, the truth is that no good can come out of killing policemen. And there is nothing good about killing and lynching black folks. But at least understand the historical significance of how we got here and why that reality exists today. Will you stay with me for a minute? Because I want to make sure you understand the framework. There's a framework of tradition that speaks against truth. And it is the problem of the men in this text who don't realize that the issue is a matter of heart. And until God can change a man's heart, then I still want you to change the law. Jesus has been dealing with this issue because he's dealing with people whose hearts are not located in a place where they need to be. And there is this issue he's going after in terms of a righteousness that belongs to him and a righteousness that man has concocted. The text in verse 5 begins with them coming to Jesus and complaining about the fact that the disciples have not washed their hands. He just fed thousands. Miraculously took fish and loaves, and thousands have been fed with leftovers. And the only thing you're concerned about is that they had eaten with dirty hands. It speaks to this issue of how sometimes people can be blind to the bigger picture. They're complaining about unwashed hands and missing the reality that Jesus has just fed thousands of people on a hill. And their concern with washing hands is not about hygiene, it's a matter of purity. In fact, there are some people who don't understand that pious behavior does not equal purity. That you can be a Bible reader. You can be a person who prays 5 times a day facing the east. You can be a person who has memorized scripture and mastered the Bible and still be a freak of the week. Still be a slave owner. Still be a lying lawyer. Still be a greedy government official. And still be corrupt in 1,000 different ways. Why? Because it's what's on the inside that actually counts. It's something about the way we're made. It's something about what goes on in our hearts that Jesus was trying to get them to recognize and to understand. That many of the things that seem to be external realities are the result of internal realities. And until you can get the inside properly resolved, you will always have these external exertions of who we really are on the inside and outside towards people whom we either like or dislike for 1,000 different reasons. And when Jesus was going after this, Jesus was going after the bigger issue, the grander narrative that's behind the narrative. It's not that just suddenly the country became racist. It's in the soil. You can't enslave human beings for hundreds of years, shed their blood, and perceive that somehow you get a pass. Violence is a part of the country you live in. Have you ever heard the Star-Spangled Banner? And you always reap what you sow. That's an irrefutable law of God. This church, at the lynching of Zachary Walker, let out service early They let out Sunday service early, walked out on Main Street, went west to participate in the lynching. These were people who were carrying their Bibles and reading their Bibles and still took souvenirs off a black man's body to take home. And they called themselves Christian. Whenever you go to the ER, you will notice that when you go into the ER, the first thing they do is they begin to ask you a lot of questions before they treat you, because they understand that the present problem has a history. And they want to know what you ate. They want to know your travel plans. They want to know who you've been around, because they recognize that the only way to deal with the present issue is by placing it in a historical context. And the historical context will tell the attending how to handle your present situation. And the only way you can understand what's taking place in America right now is if you take the time to understand the historical context. Somebody said to me, Pastor Williams, the church needs to be involved in racial reconciliation, to which Dan Williams says, I agree. But what does that look like? Because you have never seen it. You have never seen a time in this country when black people and white people were equal. So you are trying to accomplish something that you have no precedent for. You haven't seen it, and you don't even know what you're working for. And so you got to understand the history. And what Jesus does is he won't ignore the history. He goes beyond. They want to talk about dirty hands. He wants to talk about unwashed hearts. He understands something about the narrative that's behind the narrative. It's why whenever somebody comes to me with a story, what I won't do is make a judgment based upon the first thing I hear. Because what I know is there's a story behind that story. And there are times in which you cannot come to a resolve unless you're willing to go deeper. The problem is that a lot of people want to deal with the superficial, and Jesus wants to deal with the structural. They want to talk about dirty hands, the superficial. He wants to talk about dirty hearts, the structural, because he understands that dirty hands mean absolutely nothing if the heart has not yet been washed. And the only way to get at the problem of the Pharisees and the problem of the culture is by dealing with issues that have nothing to do with the externals, but have to deal with the structure. Not the superficial, but the structural and the internal. He goes at this by challenging them and moves beyond the issues that they're presenting. And in verse 20 says, it's what comes from inside that defiles you. Good people, hear me well. Sure, all lives matter. Who would deny that? The problem is all lives don't get followed in stores when they shop. All lives don't get stopped just for driving while black. All lives were not lynched and castrated. All lives were not denied voting rights 300 years ago and still today. And so when people say things like all lives matter, well, guess what? No one will deny that all lives matter, but until black lives matter, all lives don't. How can all lives matter and mine does not? And that sort of silly talk does not get at the root of an issue. All lives have not had to deal with hundreds of years of Jim Crow post-slavery. Somebody says, well, Reverend, everybody's been in slavery at some point in the country. Yes, but not every culture had to go through black, white water fountains, colored people only water fountains, sit in the back of a bus, be denied voting rights, not able to live in neighborhoods they wanted to live in, occupy universities and colleges. Not everybody had to deal with the aftermath of post-slavery Jim Crow issues. And you sound silly when you say all lives matter, because until black lives matter, all lives don't. And it's the heart of a matter that we're going after. It's silly. Nobody has gone through what African Americans have gone through in this country. Nobody has been despised merely on the basis of the color of their skin. You try living with that and tell me how post-traumatic it can be. I'm grown, insured, licensed, and when I drive a car and an officer gets behind me, I still tighten up. I was arrested my freshman year in college, thrown into the police car under the regime of Frank Rizzo. When I asked what I'd done, they said, you murdered a policeman. When all I had done was make a left turn on Market Street. Don't tell me what it feels like to be profiled, abused by a system that's supposed to protect. Don't lecture me on that. Until you live in my skin, you can't tell me what it feels to be black in America. Somebody says, well, is that Christian? Yes, because it's the truth. And there's a heart that's got to be fixed that you have to get after. No one can condemn killing people. And if you've been born again, you can't condemn it at any level. But there is a righteousness that the Pharisees have that really is not righteousness at all. You see, the text says that they are washing their hands and they are claiming that somehow this is what it means to be right with God. And external rituals will never make you right with God. You see, you can have the Bible and still not know the Christ of the Bible. And you can have a religion that has no way of intersecting with your life that challenges and changes you, which is why you could be a Christian and still be a slave owner. And the list here of the behaviors, if you notice them in 20, it is what comes from inside that defiles you, for from within, out of a person's heart come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you. And what Jesus says is that Black lives matter, all lives matter, and here's the heart of the matter. The problem is that all of these things are carried in everybody's heart. It's not that these things belong in somebody else's. Everybody's heart is filled with lying, stealing, murder, adultery, cheating, and greed. This is not a set of things that are in one heart but not in another. All of us carry these things in our heart. And Jesus was trying to get them to recognize that there is a kind of righteousness that will never deal with the issues of the heart if all it is external. In fact, I want to argue, make the case that, you know what, whenever you resist evil, you are actually participating in a form of righteousness rather than capitulating to it. When you decide that you will not be denigrated, when you decide you will not be abused, when you resist being oppressed, you are then assuming the posture of righteousness, because it's more righteous to resist abuse than to give in to it. When you give in to abuse, you are not being godly. When you resist unrighteousness, you are being godly. Now, the goal is to resist righteously. But resist you must. Because when you give in to abuse, you are not being Christian. It's at that moment you are being anti-Christian. When you resist oppression, resist being abused, resist being denigrated, at that moment you are practicing a kind of righteousness that is resisting unrighteousness. And that's why our ancestors said, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord to be free. Let me tell you what they meant. They meant before I am denigrated in that way, I'd rather die fighting. That's righteous resistance. And when anybody tries to make you believe you ought to be complacent with your condition and satisfied with the status quo, they are not helping you, they are hurting you. Because resistance to oppression, resistance to abuse is what God calls us to in an action that is righteous. This was not righteousness. This was an abuse of what God had called us to be. And it was more righteous to resist it. And the issues that we address today are not the way it's supposed to be. I went for an insurance policy some years ago, and I'm almost done. In order to get the insurance policy, what they said to me was, Reverend, when you come, we want you to wear active wear clothing. Wear your sweatpants, your sneakers, and a jacket that you can take off. And I asked them, well, why? What kind of test is this going to be? And she says, well, we got to check out your heart. And so you have to participate in what we call a stress test. And I said, okay, because I assumed that I was going to get there. They would have me walk around a little bit, do a jumping jack, then take the electrodes off and tell me, okay, you're good to go. I got there, I laid down on the table, and the lady says, okay, now I need to connect you to these, I guess they're called electrodes. And they put all this sticky stuff on me, connected these things, and then they put me on a treadmill. And they told me to walk. And then she says, I'm going to speed it up. And she says, I'm going to need you to trot. And then she said, how you doing? I said, I'm fine. She says, okay, I'm going to increase it a little bit more. And before I knew it, the Reverend was running at a good gait. And for a minute there, I thought, now come on, she playing. This thing ain't supposed to go this long. And every time I looked over at her, she's looking at this machine and playing with these knobs, and I'm thinking, come on, y'all just messing with me. I should have been done a couple of minutes ago. Finally, when the first bead of sweat started moving off my forehead, I get the point that, you know what, these people are serious. And by the time she backs that dial down and I get off that thing, the Reverend is huffing and puffing in ways that even surprised me. I said to her, what in the world are we doing here? She says, well, in a minute, we're going to take a look at a printout that's going to tell us some things. And I said, what's that? It's going to tell us how your heart is doing. And I said, so what's the point of this? She says, well, what we got to do is we got to place you in positions and situations that put stress on your heart in order to tell us the condition of your heart. Because unless we press you, unless we stress you, we can't really tell what's going on in your heart. Could I tell you what's going on in our lives right now as a culture? Right now, we are being tested. We are being pressed. And God is moving us through some hoops as a nation as well as individuals. But he's doing it in order to show us that there's some stuff in our heart that until he deals with it, we can't get it right. That until we recognize God's got to do a work on the black man and the white man and the Asian man and the Latino man, we'll never be able to get this thing right and get it to the place where God can be honored and glorified. And so right now, wherever God has you, just relax for a minute. It's not going to change anytime soon. Don't think that when you have another African American elected or a woman elected or something like that, all of a sudden we should start singing Kumbaya and we'll never have any more problems. I'm here to tell you that the reconciliation that is to come is not just around the corner. It's going to take a minute to get there. The soil is deep with the blood of a slaughtered, the blood of the soil of many laid in America, of the abused and the oppressed is there. And when you sow those seeds, there's got to be a harvest. But there is still a God. And that God says, I am the Lord of the harvest. And I can do things in the hearts of men and women that nobody else can do. Do I have a witness? Some of you have been abused on a lot of different levels. Abused by spouses, abused based on race, abused by employers. And because there is a God in your heart, you still don't hate. You still don't curse them out. You still don't want to murder anybody. That is a transformative work of God in the heart of men and women who love him. And if he did it for you, he can do it for anybody. There is this transformation of righteousness that I need that is not attainable through activity. You see, the righteousness that I need, I can't get. If I was born of my mother's womb and I never committed a sin, that would make me innocent. But it would not make me righteous. If I never did anything wrong in my life, never had a bad thought, never a bad motivation, never stole, never lied, never cheated, if I did absolutely nothing wrong, that would still only make me innocent. I still couldn't be right with God. Because what I need to be right with God is I need somebody who can give me a righteousness that I can't achieve on my own. And so what God did was God made him who knew no sin to become sin so that I might become the righteousness of God. And what the Lord has done is he's taken away the sin debt. But if that's all he did, I'd just be innocent. He then gave me his righteousness. And now when I stand before God, I'm not a murderer. I'm not a liar. I'm not a thief. I'm not a whoremonger. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not whatever you want to be. I am now clothed in the righteousness of another, not my own. Something that I couldn't earn by my own strength. Something I could not achieve by my own effort, my own good works. I stand right before God, righteous before God, based upon the work of Christ that stood in on my behalf. He died for me, and I should have died. He became the sin that I was. He stood in my place and he took my sin and then he gave me his righteousness. And in that he fixes hearts. Do I have a witness? He can change the heart from the inside out. He can make you the man, the woman, the boy, the girl that you long to be, because only God can do on the inside what nobody else can do. That is what the world needs to see. Is God gets at the heart of issues and matters that are transformative, not the Pollyannish, romanticized, let's just sing Kumbaya. When a person has been abused and oppressed, reconciliation demands reparation. You cannot take my car and drive it and dent it up and scratch it up and flatten the tires and run it empty from gas and then give it back to me and say, I'm sorry. You have to repair my car, put tires on it, put gas back in it, and then prove to me that you meant what you said. And you cannot tell me to get over it. No one tells Jews to get over the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, Jews say, never forget. No one tells the Japanese to ignore Hiroshima. And it's insensitive to say to black people and people of African descent, get over slavery. What God has to do is work a heart transformation in many of our brothers and sisters, even of a lighter hue, to recognize this as a reality and move in the process of changing this culture in this world for the glory of Christ, so that people can see him as worthy to be trusted, worthy to be believed, and understand that this is a Christ who transforms and gets at the heart of matters and allows us to be what he calls us to be. Come on and stand on your feet.